I'll just do a quick visual ID for accessibility before we start. I'm a white woman with long bleached hair, glasses, and I'm wearing a shirt with bumblebees on in front of a kind of grey background. So yeah, this is just a kind of brief overview of my master's dissertation research. I'm doing a MSc in bioarchaeology. So my project is called Overlooked but on Display, Disability in Human Remains. And just before we get into it, there are human remain images in the presentation. It's something I kind of debated whether to include or not, but due to the nature of the research, I feel like it is relevant to show current curatorial practice. All of the images will be on public museum displays, but if you're not comfortable, I'll let you know when those slides come up. So just background behind my research. There's obviously a massive ongoing debate, especially in the last 60 years, about displaying human remains in museums. Is often done for educational purposes, and there is massive public favour towards displaying human remains. I think in 2009 or 2010, English Heritage did a survey asking the public about this, and I think about 90% of the public was in favour, and not much has changed since. But obviously this display can actually lead to quite a dehumanisation of the individual behind the bones, and this is especially an issue when it comes to disability. So the aim of this project was kind of to evaluate how the curation of human skeletal remains which have links to disability through impairment are done in a variety of UK museums, looking at a couple of different case studies. And for each of these, I am trying to form an osteobiography of the individual behind the bones, kind of looking at their lived experience, and then comparing this against the curation in my case study museums, and just kind of seeing what I've got in comparison to what's on display, what's publicly available. So just on the relevance of the project, as I mentioned, this dehumanisation of the individual who was behind the bones is particularly an issue when it comes to disability in museums. Historically, disability, especially in museum spaces, was presented through this kind of lens of freakery, and they were very much allied with freak shows and freak show tradition. And unfortunately, not much has really changed, particularly if you look at things like medical museums, where disabled people, through a lot of exploitation, have formed massive parts of their collections. Because physically different was something to be sensationalized, displayed, and yeah, this exploitation led to disabled people just becoming medical specimens in museum collections a lot of the time. So several different museums were looked at to use as case studies in this project. This was mainly done based on the relevance of the display, because obviously not every display is going to be relevant to this research, but also the accessibility of the museums, because I myself am disabled. There are a lot of museums I would have liked to include, but unfortunately I found that medical museums generally aren't accessible, so a lot of them have had to be left out of this research. It's something I'd really like to look at in the future, it's just not possible for me right now. So every case study that I picked was visited, the curation was looked at, analysed, and this information is currently being supplemented by interviews I'm doing with each of the curatorial teams behind each of these displays. And all of this information is going to go on to form these osteobiographies. You're probably asking, what is an osteobiography? It's not very well known outside of bioarchaeology. It's essentially, just to simplify it as much as I can, is just forming these descriptive biographies of the individual behind the bones, looking at the kind of intersectional identity that they had in their life, the social context, anything we can find. Obviously, this is going to be limited because we are looking at their bones, but as much as we can get. So this is just a nice quote from Alexis Boutin, who's kind of really added to this research in recent years. Considering that paleopathology is the study of ancient disease, the social correlates of disabling conditions of the past have been under-theorized by bioarchaeologists and paleopathologists. So this is something that I'm trying to, contribute to, because as much as osteobiography has been done within bioarchaeology, disability is something that's often been left out of this again. Is using this kind of archaeology of personhood model, which I have the 5 main tenets of it up here, but just simply it is looking at the social context against the bones and seeing as much as we can find. And then we're kind of exploring what we can find and what this might mean for the social context of disability, particularly using things like the social model of disability, and how we can use this to then engage with the public, which is something which obviously works brilliantly for museums. This is a quote that I've just put up here because I think it links really nicely from Angela Stien, who's done a lot of work on bioarchaeology and the display of human remains. That museums are about stories, and stories are about being human. And it's something that links really nicely to osteobiography and how useful it can be as a tool within museums to tell the stories of people in the past. So in terms of my case studies, I visited 9 museums. I've got them all up here. I won't read through the list, but they were mainly focused in London, Oxford, and around Southampton, where I'm studying, just for ease of access for myself. Not every single one I visited was entirely relevant. I did look at, bigger museums and smaller museums as much as I could. But yeah, not all relevant, but very interesting insights into the different ways that various institutions will actually display human remains. So the next 3 slides do have photos of human remains, so if you're not comfortable, feel free to just listen for a little bit. So this is the first one I looked at, the British Museum. Obviously, they've got an awful lot of human remains on display in the British Museum. And this is upstairs in the Egypt galleries. So I think it was like a life and death kind of display. And this is a bioarchaeology case with the aim to educate, fair enough. But it is only showing the most extreme paleopathological cases, some of which are so extreme I've never seen case studies of, like, before going to this display, and I've looked at a lot of human remains. It pretty much, apart from the juvenile skeleton you can see there on the bottom, is only isolated, unusual bones, only showing the pathology, very little consideration of the individuals. There was very brief mentions of a couple of them where they were talking about maybe affecting their mobility, but apart from that, no consideration whatsoever. And then in contrast, just across London, you've got the Science Museum. It did have a few similar displays to the British Museum, just being very isolated studies. But this one was brilliant. This was a complete skeleton of an individual who was excavated from Denmark from a leper cemetery who had leprosy during their life. It gives social context. It has, both text and videos talking about them, talking about leprosy in the past, leprosy in the present, the isolation that these people face even today, the stigmatization they face. I had so much information about their lived experience and what that might have been like based on what we know about the social context of when they were living, where they were living. So much information. It was a really brilliant, nice surprise to see, actually. And this is actually the last case study I looked at. This was the Mary Rose, which is quite an interesting one because it had a bit of both. It had a cabinet of curiosities kind of display like the one at the British Museum, so showing illness and injury, very just isolated case studies apart from one of them. And then next to it on the left, I believe you can see there, is this complete skeleton of a probable archer, showing, the pathology on their skeleton, but also showing their lived experience. They did some facial reconstruction to kind of humanize them a bit more. There's videos about analyzing their skeleton, about their life, about their finds that we found that were next to them when they excavated. Arguably the education that they're trying to do through the more cabinet of curiosity style display is actually done a lot better through the more humanizing osteobiographical display, which was really interesting to see, actually. So what have I found so far? As I've seen in much of the literature that's been done about material objects and disability in museums, the erasure of disabled stories and this dehumanization, whether it is intentional or not, and a lot of the times it isn't, is a persistent theme in the curation of disabled human remains across all of the case studies I've looked at, apart from one. Some museums, like the Science Museum, the Mary Rose, with their more recent displays, are better. They're more humanizing. They kind of utilize the tools I'm trying to use as well, much more in line with things like the social model of disability and the osteobiographical method. But even within the same gallery, there is immense variation. And just on the side there, I've got one of the text panels from the British Museum just to kind of show what I mean. Very little consideration of the individual. So what's next? I mean, of course, I'm doing my interviews at the minute. I've still got 2 months left of research, so I'm currently right in the middle of it. I'm just trying to gain a fuller idea of all my case studies, trying to form as much of this kind of osteobiographical knowledge and potentially form some narratives out of that to help with public engagement in museums. Hopefully, yeah, at least one narrative will be formed, but obviously time constraints with the masters, we'll see how it goes. So yeah, overall, the aim of what I'm trying to do at the minute is just evaluate how the curation of the skeletal remains that I'm looking at contribute to the perception of disabled people in the present and the past. What can be done to ensure that this is authentic, positive representation and not repeating these past and still present freak show or exploitative medical displays. Obviously, this is a master's project. It's not as big, the scope isn't as large as I'd like it to be. Hopefully this will be expanded one day in the future, but yeah, that's what I'm doing for now. Yeah, these are some of the references I've used in the presentation. Yeah, thank you for listening.